Her job was to care for the ailing prince. But falling for him was never part of the deal. The stench of coal dust and boiled linens clung to the narrow halls of the Marlowick infirmary, thickening in the midday warmth that seeped through the warped window panes. Elisa Harrow moved swiftly through the ward, her skirts brushing against the wooden floor as she carried a small porcelain basin to the bedside of a girl no older than 13. Pale and hollow-cheeked, the child coughed softly into her pillow. Her breath rattled. "She needs another compress," Elisa murmured to the apprentice beside her. "And you must tell the cook she's to have broth twice a day. She can't keep down the barley bread." Behind her, a clipped voice cut through the room like a blade. "Miss Harrow." Elisa turned, drying her hands on her apron. Lady Edwina Barrack stood in the doorway, her posture as stiff as the lace at her throat. The patroness of the infirmary wore her disdain as visibly as her high-boned hairstyle, her powdered wig rigid above a face untouched by labor or compassion. "Elisa," she said too calmly, "step outside with me." The girl in the bed stirred. Elisa gave her a reassuring touch before following Lady Edwina past rows of beds into the hallway. The door shut with a soft thud behind them. "You interfered in the diagnosis of a patient," Edwina said at once without preamble. "You undermined Dr. Ewald Sims's authority by insisting the miner's daughter wasn't malingering." "She isn't," Elisa said, her voice steady. "She has fluid in her lungs. I've treated it before." "You treated it," Edwina repeated, one brow arching. "Despite having no formal license, no noble sponsor, and no invitation to speak." Elisa's breath tightened, but she refused to lower her eyes. She would have been sent home to die. Edwina stepped closer. "Do you know what separates a nurse from a servant, Miss Harrow? Obedience. You may possess a competent hand, but you have neither discretion nor humility. You are dismissed, effective, immediately." The words rang like a bell inside her skull. "I beg your pardon." "No pay," Edwina continued, "and no reference. You may collect your things before the hour ends." The hallway felt suddenly narrower. Elisa's spine stiffened against the heat rising in her face. She said nothing. To beg would be pointless. The staff stood frozen just beyond the doorway, heads half-turned, pretending not to hear. One of them had once wept into Elisa's arms after her son died. Another owed her his recovery from fever. None spoke. Elisa left the building with her chin lifted, each footstep on the stone steps echoing louder than the last. She did not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. The sky opened as she turned onto the main street, and the soft drizzle became a sheet of rain. By the time she reached her cottage on the edge of town, her dress clung to her skin, and her cap hung limply at her nape. Inside, she lit the hearth with trembling fingers. The warmth from the flame did little to ease the chill that had burrowed beneath her skin. She sat at the edge of the small table, her apron sodden in her lap, staring at nothing. There were no family letters to write, no lover to confide in. Her mother had died years ago, her father longer still. She had built her life on quiet competence, on the skill of her hands and the dignity of her silence. And with 3 sentences, it was gone. By dusk, word had spread. A knock came at the door. Old Mr. Hemsworth from the mill, his breath wheezing from the hill. "I heard, Miss Harrow. If there's anything." He trailed off. She smiled, or tried to. "Thank you." He offered her no coin, no work, only the sorrow of someone who understood he had no power to help. She thanked him again, closed the door softly, and sat in the dark. When the knock came again, it was sharp, different. She opened it to find a tall footman in a deep navy livery embroidered with a silver thistle. Behind him, a black carriage with the crest of Avonlea gleamed under the lantern light, rain dripping from the edges of its gilt panels. "Elisa Harrow?" the footman asked. "Yes." He handed her a sealed letter with a heavy wax crest. The envelope was thick, perfumed faintly with myrrh and ink. "The prince is ill," he said, watching her face. Gravely. "We are to escort you to Blackthorn Hall." She blinked. "Me? Your name was put forward by someone within the palace. You are requested as a private nurse. It is not a suggestion." Elisa opened the letter with cold fingers. The script was formal, the language clipped. She was to report at once. No explanation of why, no offer of compensation. Just an order, and her name, written in the official hand of the palace physician. She hesitated, then nodded. "I'll need 10 minutes." The journey began before sunrise, her belongings packed into a single satchel. They traveled through winding roads that curved along misted hillsides, the carriage wheels thudding over cobblestones, slick with mud. Elisa sat in silence, wrapped in her cloak, watching the grey sky press lower over the countryside. By midday, the mountain pass narrowed. Forests thickened, the air grew colder. Then, as the road curved once more, Blackthorn Hall appeared through the mist, vast, monolithic, and crowned by spires that cut into the clouds. Its stone walls were the color of ash, the windows tall and shuttered. A fortress, disguised as a palace. The carriage stopped beneath the arched entrance. Servants in dark uniforms emerged silently, not one of them meeting her eyes. She was not welcomed, only acknowledged, a necessary inconvenience. Mistress Blythe, the head of the household staff, met her at the base of the marble stair. A woman in her 60s, Blythe's silver hair was pulled so tightly into a bun, it seemed to stretch the corners of her mouth downward. "You are to go to His Highness's bedchamber directly. Do not wander. Do not speak unless spoken to." Elisa inclined her head. "Yes, ma'am." The interior of the palace was dim, lit by sconces that flickered against stone and gold. The air smelled of wax, paper, and the faintest trace of lavender. Her boots echoed over the polished floor as she was led up 2 flights of stairs, down a narrow corridor, and through an arched doorway guarded by 2 sentinels. "This is his room," Blythe said, opening the door with a final glance. "You are expected." Then she was gone. Elisa stepped into the chamber. The room was cavernous and shadowed, lit by a single taper on a side table. Heavy drapes covered the windows. The scent of damp linens and stale perfume lingered in the air. A high-backed chair sat near the hearth, unoccupied. The bed dominated the space, a 4-poster carved from dark oak, its canopy draped in burgundy velvet. She moved closer, the silence so complete she could hear the rustle of her skirts. Her eyes swept over the figure lying there, half covered by the silk counterpane, dark hair spread across the pillow. She froze. The prince's eyes were open, watching her. They were green, not the dull, washed green of old tapestries, but vivid, alive. She hadn't expected him conscious, alert. He studied her face as though committing it to memory. His expression was unreadable. Then he spoke. "Elisa Harrow." His voice was low, hoarse from illness, but there was no mistaking the precision with which he said her name. She stared at him, heart beating like a drum in her ears. She had never met him before, never stepped foot in the palace, never spoken to anyone of rank, much less royalty. He said her name again, as if testing it, feeling it, and Elisa had no idea how he knew it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though Elisa would not have called it restful. From the moment she stepped into Prince Nicholas's chamber each morning, every movement she made was observed, measured, catalogued. Mistress Blythe remained a constant presence, sometimes physical, standing just outside the threshold of the prince's room with a ledger in hand, and other times, a pressure Elisa could feel even when alone, like the ache of a too-tight corset. The woman's eyes, when they landed on her, held no cruelty, only the cold certainty that she did not belong. Elisa bore it in silence. She always had. She remained in the prince's quarters or in the servants' wing, as instructed. She ate alone, seated at the far end of the staff table, her food plain and quiet. No one engaged her in conversation beyond what was necessary. Most averted their eyes. Whether it was fear or contempt, she wasn't sure. It didn't matter. She was here for one reason only. The man behind the heavy velvet curtains, whose fever still clung to him like a second skin. Prince Nicholas did not speak again of knowing her name. In fact, in the days after their first meeting, he said very little at all. He lay propped against white pillows trimmed in gold thread, his dark hair damp with sweat, his nightshirt wrinkled at the collar. His cheekbones were prominent, skin pallid, but there was something sharp beneath the surface. A watchfulness in the way his eyes moved when he thought no one noticed. He watched Elisa more than he should have. She tried not to acknowledge it, but she felt it. The weight of his gaze as she measured tinctures, as she dampened cloths to cool his brow, as she adjusted the buttons at his throat. He had no right to stare at her like that. And yet she didn't tell him to stop. Once, while changing the compress at his wrist, he remarked quietly, "You don't tremble." She looked up from the bandage. "Should I?" "Most do." His mouth curved, not quite into a smile. "Even the ones with titles. Perhaps they were taught to tremble. I was not." She returned to her task. "Hold still." He did, but she felt his gaze linger long after she turned away. At night, when his sleep was restless, she would read aloud from the old volumes stacked in the chamber's side cabinet. His taste in literature leaned toward philosophy and travel, but she favored the fables hidden behind the histories, stories of distant kingdoms and clever girls who outwitted kings. He never asked her to read, but he never stopped her either. Sometimes she would glance up to find his eyes closed, his breathing shallow, and think he had drifted off, only for him to say something when she paused, his voice low and dry. "Don't stop." So she continued. It was on the fourth evening that she began to question the records kept by the court physicians. Nicholas's pulse was erratic, his skin clammy, his response to standard treatments far too sluggish. She pored over the chart hanging near the door, frowning at the inked notations. Laudanum, administered regularly in heavy doses. An herbal draft that included nightshade, in quantities high enough to dull cognition. They weren't treating a fever. They were muting him. She brought the matter to the palace physician, a stooped man with yellowed cuffs and a superior smile. "With respect, sir," she said carefully, "the prince's current regimen is more sedative than curative. His heart rate has been dangerously low. Reducing the laudanum may... You are here to tend to His Highness's linens and ensure he remains hydrated," he interrupted, "not to critique a treatment devised by His Majesty's appointed medical council. I only mean... You are dismissed, Miss Harrow." She didn't argue. She only bowed her head and returned to Nicholas's chamber, hands cold with fury. That evening she quietly altered the dosage. She removed the laudanum altogether, replacing it with valerian and willow bark. She steeped herbs in cloth and placed them near his skin, changed his bedding more often, and lifted the drapes each morning to allow in light. Within 2 days, the difference was undeniable. He woke clearer, his speech steadier. He asked for a basin and combed his own hair. On the 6th morning, he requested tea. Mistress Blythe narrowed her eyes when she saw him sitting upright. "The physician will be informed," she said stiffly. Nicholas's reply was lethargic but dry. "Do send my regards." That afternoon he asked Elisa to sit, just for a moment. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair near the hearth, folding her hands in her lap. "Where were you trained?" he asked, watching her. "I wasn't." "No formal schooling? No noble sponsor?" "No," she said, her voice even. "Only a mother who taught me to work with herbs, and a town willing to let me learn through necessity." He was quiet. "You've a steady hand, and you've a sharp tongue for someone recently unconscious." His brow arched, a spark of something flickering in his expression. "If I say thank you, will you be satisfied?" "I doubt it," she replied. But her lips twitched, almost smiling. Later that evening, as she turned down the bed linens and refolded his dressing gown at the foot of the mattress, Nicholas spoke again. "When I was 12, he said quietly, I tried to climb the wall near the east garden." She paused. He hadn't spoken of himself before. "I wanted to see what was beyond it," he went on. "The guards caught me halfway up. I was thrashed, and the king ordered the gardeners to trim the hedges higher. I've never been beyond the palace grounds." Her hands stilled. "Not even once?" He shook his head. "Not even once." She turned slowly toward him, unsure why the confession lodged so deeply in her chest. There was no self-pity in his voice, no plea for sympathy, just a quiet resignation that felt more intimate than a touch. "I'm sorry," she said. He shrugged with one shoulder. "You're the first person to say that." She didn't answer. She only turned back toward the window, where the moon had risen above the mist, casting a soft glow over the trimmed lawns below. She remained there longer than usual, arms wrapped loosely around herself. The air was cold, even within the chamber, and her breath fogged faintly on the glass. Outside, the palace gardens shimmered silver and still, a world locked behind walls she could not cross. She could feel him watching her again, not with the distance of royalty, with something else, something uncertain. "Why do they fear you?" he asked suddenly. The question slipped through the quiet like a thread pulled from tightly woven cloth. Elisa turned, startled. "What?" His gaze held hers. "The servants, Mistress Blythe, the physician, even the guards. Why do they fear you?" Before she could respond, a soft rustling sound caught her attention. Voices just beyond the chamber door, low and urgent. Nicholas's expression changed. Elisa held up a hand and stepped toward the door, pressing her ear to the heavy wood. Two servants were speaking in hurried tones. "She's still here?" "I thought she left hours ago." "No, she's in with him, and Lady Cecilia's not pleased. She won't let her stay much longer. Not with him looking at her like that. She doesn't know how dangerous it is to be seen by the prince. Someone ought to warn her." Their footsteps receded. Silence settled again. Elisa backed away from the door, her heart suddenly tight in her chest. She looked at Nicholas, then at the room around her, the high windows, the curtained bed, the closed space that now felt more like a cell than a chamber. She realized then that her presence was not merely inconvenient to the court. It was unwanted, and perhaps even dangerous to someone with power. Rain streaked down the tall windows of the east wing, a relentless rhythm that filled the silence between footsteps and glances and half-swallowed conversations. The storm had rolled in without ceremony, darkening the sky to slate and casting Blackthorn Hall in an eerie pallor that settled into the corridors like breath held too long. Prince Nicholas had taken his first walk beyond his chambers that morning. Only as far as the drawing room, leaning on a cane, but it was movement nonetheless. Progress. The court had whispered of his return to health in tight-lipped circles, masking surprise with decorum. He greeted none of them. Only Elisa. Their eyes met across the corridor. She had just emerged from the linen room with a fresh towel pressed to her chest, her cap slightly askew, damp curls escaping at her temples. He paused, faintly breathless, one hand on the wall, as if her presence had startled him more than the climb. "You're upright," she said, cautious and quiet. "Don't tell the physicians," he murmured. "They might dose me back into silence." She lowered her gaze quickly, but not before the corner of his mouth lifted. A smile, faint but unmistakably for her. By midday, the atmosphere in the palace shifted. The servants moved faster, shoulders straighter. Footsteps echoed with more purpose. And then she heard the name spoken, first in a murmur by the footman outside the prince's quarters, then more clearly by Mistress Blythe at supper, her lips pressed into a pale line. Lady Cecilia Halcroft had returned to court. The moment Cecilia entered the corridor outside the prince's room, the air seemed to tighten. She wore a traveling gown of emerald brocade, dustless despite the storm, her blonde hair arranged in a polished coil that glinted with pearls. Her eyes, pale and impassive, swept over the surroundings with the cool detachment of someone returning to a place she never truly left. Elisa stepped back without realizing it, still holding the tray of laundered cloths. Their eyes met. Cecilia's expression did not change, but her gaze slowed, appraising, and something cold settled at the base of Elisa's spine. "You must be Miss Harrow," Cecilia said, voice like porcelain tapped by a fingernail. "I'm told you've taken excellent care of His Highness." "I've done what was needed," Elisa answered, lowering her head slightly in respect, though her posture remained straight. Cecilia gave a slight, inscrutable smile. "And now that he's better, you may finally rest." From that moment forward, the tone of the palace altered with precision. Cecilia made no direct demands, none that could be quoted, but her influence seeped into the routines like ink into water. She visited Nicholas daily, never staying long, but always at hours Elisa had once reserved for quiet reading or conversation. She began appearing during morning assessments, observing silently as Elisa checked the prince's temperature or adjusted his bandages. Once, in the presence of 2 footmen, she asked Elisa whether she'd had formal certification. The question was framed politely, purely a matter of record-keeping, but it left Elisa with the sensation of a door quietly shutting behind her. Soon after, the court physician resumed his visits, this time unprompted. He reviewed every tonic, every treatment, every note Elisa had made in the care log. He did not remove her, but he hovered now, as though waiting for her to falter. Elisa said nothing. Her pride ached, but not as sharply as the feeling blooming in her chest when Nicholas looked at her across the room, eyes alert, brow furrowed, mouth drawn in frustration that never reached his voice. He did not stop Cecilia's interference, but he watched Elisa more closely than ever. One evening, as the storm deepened and thunder rolled over the hills, Elisa found herself hurrying through the garden portico toward the rear library. She had been searching for a medical text, an obscure volume she remembered from a footnote in her training, when the sky opened again. She reached the heavy oak door with her dress soaked to the hem and her shawl clinging to her arms. Inside, the air was thick with paper and dust and the faint scent of old roses. A fire burned low in the grate, barely alive. She was reaching for the nearest oil lamp when a voice stopped her. "Close the door. You'll drown the hearth." She turned, startled. Nicholas was seated in the far corner, a blanket across his lap, one leg bent against the arm of the chair. He looked far less like a prince than usual, his cravat undone, the top buttons of his shirt open, shadows softening his jaw. In the glow of the fire, his eyes looked darker, more uncertain. "I didn't realize," she began. He gestured to the hearth. "Sit before you catch death. I've heard you're inconveniently difficult to replace." She hesitated, then stepped closer, feeling the weight of her soaked skirts with every step. He reached for the poker and stirred the coals, coaxing light from the embers. The glow touched the curve of his cheek, casting it in gold. "You're shivering," he said. "I'm wet," she replied dryly. He rose, slowly, and reached for the shawl slipping from her shoulders. She should have stopped him, should have stepped back, but the motion was gentle, almost absent-minded, as he draped it over the back of a nearby chair and guided her toward the warmth. "Here," he said. "Sit." She did, hands folded tight in her lap, as the fire breathed back to life. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind sighed against the window panes. The rain drummed overhead like 1,000 beating wings. Then Nicholas said softly, "You never asked for anything." She looked at him. "What would I have asked for? Comfort, credit, praise." Elisa shook her head slowly. "No one's ever asked what I wanted." His expression changed, not with pity, but with something softer, a quiet tension, a recognition. "What do you want?" he asked. She stared into the fire. Her voice, when it came, felt fragile. "To do the work I know how to do, without having to defend it at every step, to speak without being reminded of where I came from, to be seen." Nicholas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, gaze fixed on her face. "I see you." She drew in a breath, a knot forming at the center of her chest. The firelight danced between them, painting gold across the carpet, the spines of books, the folds of her skirt. She stood quickly. "I should go." He rose too. "Elisa." She paused. The sound of her name, spoken like that, halted her in place. She turned slowly, her eyes lifting to his. His mouth parted as though he meant to say more, but before he could speak, the door opened. Lady Cecilia stepped inside, wrapped in a traveling cloak, still glistening with rain. She took in the scene, the fire, the chairs, Elisa's flushed face, the prince's undone collar, and her pale eyes narrowed just slightly, calculating. "Your Highness," she said coolly. "We were beginning to worry." Nicholas said nothing. He stood straighter, the moment gone. Elisa inclined her head. "I'll leave you." She slipped past Cecilia without waiting for a response, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her steps were measured, but her hands shook by the time she reached the corridor. The next morning, the entire court was summoned to the grand receiving hall. Elisa stood in the back, pressed between footmen and stewards, her apron folded over one arm. She did not know what had prompted the gathering until Mistress Blythe whispered beside her, voice clipped and low. "An alliance. It seems His Highness is to be wed." Elisa's stomach dropped. At the front of the room, the King's Council stood beside a herald. Prince Nicholas remained silent as the announcement was made, a formal betrothal to Duchess Amelie of Villonia. The union, they explained, would solidify trade, reinforce diplomatic ties, and ensure the continuation of the royal line. No one clapped. Elisa stared at Nicholas, but he never turned toward the crowd. His expression was unreadable. That evening, as she folded towels with numb hands, Mistress Blythe entered her quarters. She handed over an envelope without comment. Elisa opened it with deliberate care. Her services were no longer required. She was to leave by sundown the following day. Now, as night fell again, she packed the few belongings she had brought. A spare gown, her worn satchel, the comb her mother had given her. Her hands moved without thought. The candle on the nightstand guttered low. She knew she would not be allowed to say goodbye. The knock at the door was soft, almost hesitant. Elisa hesitated before crossing the small chamber. The knock was soft, almost uncertain, but insistent enough to draw her from where she sat folding the last of her belongings into her satchel. Her fingers paused on the frayed edge of her shawl, the one she'd worn that first mist-heavy morning to Blackthorn Hall. The candle flickered beside her, casting long shadows over the stone walls and the rough blanket on the cot. She opened the door slowly. Nicholas stood there, his shoulder braced against the frame, his eyes shadowed beneath the soft glow of the sconces in the corridor. He looked older than he had the day before, as though the weight of the entire court had pressed against him in one endless night. His collar was loose, his coat undone, as if he'd left in haste. His dark hair fell untamed over his brow, still damp from the rain that had not yet stopped. "I heard," he said. She kept her hand on the doorknob, not stepping back, not stepping forward. "They've given me until sundown." "They shouldn't have," he replied. There was a beat of silence. She waited for him to say something else, something that might explain the weight in his eyes or the tightness of his jaw. But he said nothing. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out the envelope she hadn't expected to see again. The dismissal order, folded, creased, and damp at the corners. He held it between two fingers, then tore it cleanly in half. "You can't," she started, her breath catching. I can, he said softly. I didn't authorize it. I never agreed to it. Her mouth parted, but no words came. I didn't agree to the betrothal either, he added, quieter still. I woke to find my name attached to a treaty. Cecilia and the council moved quickly while I was half drugged and silent. But that is not my choice. You're the prince, she said, her voice tight. Your duty, my duty, he interrupted, stepping closer, has been used as a leash my entire life. This time I choose. She looked down, forcing her hands to remain still at her sides. You can't choose me, he exhaled, as though those words struck deeper than they should have. I never asked for this, she continued. You know that. I didn't come here looking for favor, or a title, or… I know. His voice was hoarse. That's why I can't let you go. Her eyes met his then, the impact of his words settling in her chest like a slow burn. He wasn't offering promises, wasn't pledging a future gilded with impossible dreams. He was just telling her the truth, his truth, laid bare with a quiet desperation that tugged at something deep within her. Before she could reply, a heavy knock sounded down the hall, followed by a voice they both recognized. His Highness is summoned to the banquet. The council is assembled. Nicholas straightened. His expression shuttered, the moment between them tightening like a string pulled taut. He looked back at her once more, voice low and steady. I will not let them decide for me. And then he turned and walked away. The hours that followed moved like smoke through the corridors, slow and suffocating. Servants rushed past with trays of wine and polished silver, their expressions composed, but eyes alert. Gilded candelabras were lit in the grand hall, velvet drapes pulled back to reveal tall windows veiled in rain. The palace came alive with sound, the scrape of boots, the clink of goblets, the flutter of whispered expectation. Elisa remained in the shadows near the periphery of the hall, dressed in her plain slate gown, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She had not been formally invited, but no one stopped her. Perhaps they no longer knew what to do with her. The nobility gathered in slow, curated clusters. Silver-threaded gowns and lacquered shoes, powdered wigs and jeweled pins catching the candlelight. Cecilia was there, resplendent in a sapphire blue gown cut to perfection, her chin lifted, her smile poised and hollow. At her side stood members of the council, including Lord Harwood, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the crowd. And then Nicholas entered. He wore a formal coat of deep crimson, the gold trim catching fire beneath the chandeliers. His cravat was pinned with a sapphire brooch, the Avonlea crest at his collar. His steps were slow, deliberate, measured like a man walking toward something irrevocable. The hall quieted. He lifted a goblet of dark wine, raising it in what seemed to be the start of a toast. To peace, he said. A murmur of approval moved through the room. To the alliances that bind our kingdoms, he continued, his voice clear, unwavering. To the strength of this land, and to the clarity of truth. That was when the first shift came, not in his voice, but in his posture. He no longer stood as a prince honoring a contract. He stood as a man revealing one. I did not agree to this marriage, he said, and the words fell like stones. I was never consulted. I was not conscious. I was barely coherent. And in that silence, a treaty was signed in my name. A few nobles shifted, faces tightening. He went on, his voice low and even. I have been fed opiates without consent. I was weakened under the guise of care, and the woman responsible for restoring my strength was ordered from this palace, not for failure, but for success. The crowd stilled. Nicholas turned then, facing the hall fully. Her name is Elisa Harrow. She is a healer, a woman of no title, no property, no noble blood. She is the reason I stand here now. Heads turned. Some gasped aloud. Cecilia's face lost its color. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Nicholas continued. This court prefers compliance over truth, appearances over compassion. but I will not pretend to honor a vow I never made. I will not wed a stranger when my loyalty, my respect, my heart lies elsewhere." Silence flooded the hall. The only sound was the rain beating against the high glass. Then came the soft rustle of fabric as the king stood. He had remained seated throughout, no interruptions, no gestures. But now he rose, his expression unreadable beneath the weight of decades of monarchy. He looked at his son, then at the gathered nobles. He said nothing. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the hall. By morning the sky had cleared, but the tension within the palace had not. A private council was summoned, and with it, a sealed order was delivered to Elisa's chamber. She stood in the center of the room, still wearing the same gown from the night before, the edges of her sleeves wrinkled from where she'd gripped them too tightly. She followed the steward down the corridor, past portraits of kings and queens long buried, past tapestries that had absorbed centuries of secrets. Her footsteps echoed too loudly. Her palms were damp. They reached the king's study, tall doors carved with the emblem of Avonlea. Nicholas was already there, his face drawn but calm. He did not reach for her, did not smile, but something in his eyes anchored her in place. The king sat at his desk. Papers lay in front of him. A single quill rested in his hand. He looked first at his son, then at Elisa. "You may have what you desire," he said slowly, "but it will cost you the throne." The silence in the king's study was unlike any Elisa had known before. It wasn't the hushed quiet of reverence, nor the solemn stillness of a sick room. It was something brittle and absolute, as if the walls themselves waited to shatter. The king had spoken. His voice had not risen, but its weight was enough to still the air. "You may have what you desire, but it will cost you the throne." Elisa felt the breath catch in her throat. Nicholas stood beside her, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. She didn't dare move. To move would be to disturb the delicate, shivering stillness between words. The king's eyes were fixed on his son. There was no cruelty in them, only the solemn gravity of a man who had watched his world shift and knew he could not stop it. "I will sign the renunciation myself," Nicholas said without a second's pause. The steward behind the king inhaled sharply. Papers on the desk rustled in the quiet. "I do not want a throne built on a life I did not choose," Nicholas added, his voice low and steady. "I will not trade love for a crown." He didn't look at Elisa as he spoke. He didn't need to. The words were not performance or persuasion. They were truth, worn and sure and quietly fierce. The king gave the smallest nod, and the spell of silence broke. Papers were brought forward. A quill placed in Nicholas's hand. He signed his name without trembling. The chaos that followed did not come with shouting. It came in the crackle of murmured disbelief, the shuffling of feet, the urgent whispers passed from steward to scribe, from advisor to noble. Behind closed doors, the court would unravel in quiet rage and disbelief. But here, in this moment, it was done. Nicholas turned to Elisa. His hand reached for hers, a touch simple and unadorned, and she took it. 3 days later, the final seal was pressed in wax. Prince Nicholas of Avonlea was no longer heir to the crown. The title passed to a distant cousin, one whom Elisa had never seen and Nicholas had never trusted. The announcement was made without ceremony, and just like that, Blackthorn Hall ceased to belong to him. Their exile came not in the form of punishment, but in a quiet arrangement. The king's envoy delivered a deed to a coastal estate far to the south, a weathered manor perched on a cliff's edge overlooking the sea. The land was modest by royal standards, but beautiful, untouched, a place for beginning, not retreat. Neither of them spoke much on the journey. The carriage was silent, save for the clatter of hooves on dirt road and the wind whistling through the trees as they moved farther from the palace, farther from everything they had known. When they arrived, the sun was setting, casting the sky in a wash of pink and gold. The estate was smaller than Elisa expected, a stone house of warm grey with ivy curling along its walls and a narrow path that led directly to the cliff's edge. The scent of salt clung to the air, the kind that filled the lungs and lingered on the skin. She stepped out of the carriage and stood there for a long moment, her hands folded tightly, breathing it in. Nicholas came to stand beside her. He didn't speak. He only looked out at the horizon with her. In the days that followed, they fell into a rhythm that was entirely new and entirely theirs. Elisa rose with the sun and walked the cliffs. Nicholas tended the neglected gardens. They shared meals in the kitchen rather than the dining hall, and when the fire died down at night, they sat close without needing to fill the silence. Their wedding came 2 weeks after the move, not announced but not hidden. Word had reached the nearby village, and the chapel, a weathered stone building no larger than a drawing room, opened its doors to the sound of the tide. Elisa wore a gown of cream muslin, soft and unstructured. Her hair was pulled back simply, the way she wore it when she worked, with no pins, no jewels, nothing to obscure the shape of her face. She carried no bouquet. Her hands were bare. Nicholas stood waiting near the altar, dressed in a dark wool coat, the simplest he had ever worn. He held nothing but her gaze as she walked toward him. There were no royal guests, no musicians, only a scattering of villagers who had brought wildflowers in their arms, and a few quiet allies from Blackthorn, a footman who had once brought her tea without being asked, a young maid who had pressed her hand when no one else dared. The ceremony was brief, the vows simple. Elisa spoke them with a steady voice, her gaze never wavering. She did not promise to obey. She promised to stand beside him, to meet him in truth, to never forget the long road that brought them there. Nicholas's vows were quieter, but his voice did not falter. He did not speak of kingdoms or legacies. He spoke of the nights she stayed when no one else would, of her hands that healed when his strength had gone, of choosing her, not in spite of everything, but because of it. They kissed with the sea wind curling through the chapel and the sound of waves echoing off the stone. That night, they danced in the kitchen, barefoot, with no music but the distant sound of the tide. He held her close, her cheek pressed to his chest, and neither of them said a word. Months passed. Elisa stood at the edge of the garden, her shawl lifting in the wind, the sea stretching out before her in endless motion. The cliff beneath her was firm, the grass cool beneath her slippers. She looked out not as someone waiting, but as someone arrived. Behind her, footsteps approached, quiet, sure. Nicholas slipped his hand into hers. She turned to him and smiled, no longer uncertain, no longer afraid. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like to show your support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotions and life lessons. And before we say goodbye, we'd like to remind you that on the end screen, you'll see a recommendation for another exciting and charming story. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.